Welcome to Todd Talk. Today we're going to talk about phobias.
Todd Talk is brought to you by... We put the... in...
So I think everybody is afraid of something. I definitely have a few phobias. And looking at the definition, a phobia is, in psychiatry, words that describe irrational, abnormal, unwarranted, persistent, or disabling fears as a mental disorder. So there are some things that are natural to be afraid of. We don't like to be hurt. We're often afraid of the unknown. And many of these irrational phobias are rooted in these actual fears. I think humans are sort of hardwired to be self-preservation machines. You know, we avoid pain and danger. But some of these fears can be very specific or very unusual and really sort of unwarranted. You know, as an example, one thing that many people are afraid of is the dark. And generally speaking, in a modern society, there's nothing that can hurt you in the dark. But what is scary is that it is all unknown. You can't see what is actually there. And so the things that potentially could hurt you or that, you know, are actual dangers could be hidden in that darkness. And honestly, the things that I am afraid of are completely avoidable in a modern society by and large, and really not as unrational as some phobias can be. You know, some fears are very specific. For example, arachnophobia, fear of spiders. Most spiders aren't going to hurt you. They're probably more afraid of you than you are of them. But our monkey brains are hardwired to be leery of weird eight-legged things. There's also some really peculiar ones, like globophobia is the fear of balloons. Arachnophobia is the fear of beards. And you know, to have those kinds of fears, I feel like something very specific and very traumatic happened to you. There are other fears that get into more of like a dislike rather than an actual terror. For example, there's arachnophobia, which is a dislike of shellfish. Another example would be like transphobia, which would be dislike or fear of transsexual people. Phobias run the whole gamut, everything from the very seemingly innocuous to the actually pretty terrible. When I was younger, I used to be afraid of dogs. Growing up, we didn't have a dog, and the dogs I had in my neighborhood were loud and aggressive. And so walking to the bus stop or riding my bike, they were always these little maelstroms of anger and aggression that were pretty terrifying for a 8 to 10-year-old. Nowadays, I don't have any problem with dogs, and I think they're great, but it's those sorts of things that kind of are rooted sometimes in your childhood that develop into these kind of weird and bizarre phobias that you have later in life. So legitimately, I have 4 pretty severe phobias. Starting with the most common, I am very afraid of heights. And it's not specifically being at a high elevation. For example, I can fly in an airplane without much fear or problem, but it's edges or ledges. So, you know, observation towers, bridges, those sorts of things where the edge is sort of just like right there. That's really hard for me. I've been in a few situations, specifically hiking. There are a few hikes in the Pacific Northwest where you are really high up and the edge is very precarious. One example that comes to mind is Eagle Creek. It's a very tall, very sheer trail where they actually have bolted a cable into the wall so you have something to hold on to. There were parts of that were really hard for me to do. Another hike I did recently was Cape Lookout. Cape Lookout is this very big spit that pokes a couple of miles out into the Pacific Ocean. It sticks out so far that during World War II, an airplane crashed into it in some fog. And when you're hiking out Cape Lookout, you are right on the edge of this spit, and it's a couple hundred feet straight down to the Pacific Ocean. There's a few parts that are just really terrifying. And when I end up in those situations where the edge is kind of right there, I will get this sensation that, A, I can't trust my feet. that if I pick up one of my feet, I might fall. I can't depend on my other foot to keep me steady. And so I will just kind of freeze sometimes, or I will just sort of crouch and touch the ground. I've been in a few other situations. There was a hike on the Columbia River Gorge called Hamilton Mountain. And there is a portion where you're doing this zigzag back and forth up the face of this mountain. And at one point, it zigged, but I didn't notice. And there was sort of a little rabbit trail that I just kept following for a few moments. And then I realized I was literally just on the edge of the world. It was so far down. And I, again, just froze. There was nowhere for me to go this way and hundreds of feet down in that direction. Typically what happens in these situations is I just freeze and sort of get out of my mind and then find the wherewithal to reposition my feet and get myself back out of that. But in the moment, it is absolutely terrifying. There's another moment I remember from my mid-20s where I went to watch fireworks with some friends, and we were sitting on the Willamette River in Portland, Oregon, and one of my friends just sort of hopped up on the railing of the bridge to watch. And if they leaned back, it was, 100 feet down to the river, and it was just so awful for me to see them there, because I knew that if I was there, I don't know that I would trust myself not to fall off. There's this weird thing that there's a French term for, and it translates roughly to the call of the void. And it is this feeling that the edge is sort of pulling you towards it. It's very unsettling. And there are certain places where it's not even that high. Like when you're at a shopping mall and you're on the second floor and you're near the edge, and it's just this sort of false gravity that makes you want to err in that direction. And so it's this icky feeling of not wanting to be near the edge. Similarly, if you're on the roof of a house, it's only 10 feet up to the gutters, but when you are close to that edge, it feels like it's sort of pulling you off. Anyway, fear of heights, it's a very real thing for me, and it's awful. Besides the hiking, there's been a few times where I have faced it. I went to the top of the Willis Tower or the Sears Tower in Chicago. They have an observation deck that's 103 stories off the street, and it's just glass. So you can step out on this piece of glass over Chicago. And I did it. I took a step out, took a picture of my feet, but man, it just took everything that I had to step out there. It just goes against every fiber of your being. It just feels so wrong. So the other thing I'm kind of afraid of is open water. I don't mind being in a swimming pool or a bathtub or that sort of thing. But when you're on a river or the ocean where the bottom is invisible, that's really unsettling for me. Part of it is just that there's this void that could swallow you up and you would be gone forever. And the other thing is there could be things down there that are much scarier and bigger than you are. With the ocean, of course, there are sharks and squids and whales and all kinds of big, monstrous fish and things like that, which are pretty crazy. But there was one time I was jet skiing on the Columbia River, which is a very, very big river, and I hit a wave wrong and I fell off, and just being in the middle of that vast space was so unsettling. So yeah, I've never been on a sailboat or a cruise or anything like that. I don't know that I would ever rule it out, but I think I would have a hard time with some of that. My other two phobias are a little less extreme and a little bit more weird. So one thing I'm afraid of is fish hooks. It's not that I'm afraid of everything sharp. Sharp things are scary in their own right in that they are potentially dangerous and deserve a little bit of respect. So, a kitchen knife or a pocket knife, you are appropriate and careful with it. But fish hooks are weird in that they're barbed. So if you do poke yourself, the only way to get it out is to continue to push it through. You can't pull it back out. And just that fact I find really, really unnerving. Unlike a knife, they don't have a handle or a flat part to really hold on to. So they are just this precarious danger point that you hold on to. And I just find that really, really icky. So the last phobia I have is not something that is dangerous or scary, but it just invokes a really severe reaction in me. I've always felt it, and then I found out it had a name, and I discovered other people have this too, and it's something called trypophobia. Basically, trypophobia is just a fear of holes or patterns with holes in them. I remember when I was in grade school, I used to be a very inquisitive and very curious person. I would do a lot of reading encyclopedias and different books, and there was a toad that I discovered. It was called a Suriname toad. The thing that's interesting about the Suriname toad is it has these very large pores on its back. And when it lays eggs and then they become tadpoles, they live in these pores on its back. And I found that so uncomfortable and unnerving. And since then, there are other patterns and textures like that that are just really, really aversive, really disgusting for me to look at. It's really hard to explain why it is so offensive, but just seeing something like that, it just makes me turn away, or it's like a revulsion. So I'll do a trigger warning, but I will put up a couple of images that I find unnerving or icky to look at, and you can kind of see where you land. So there's things like this frog. There's just patterns like this. There are some biological things like this. And then there's artwork like this that also evokes that feeling. So those are basically the things I'm afraid of. I mean, there's all the other normal stuff like nuclear war and cancer and all that, but that's a whole other video. Leave me a comment, let me know what you're afraid of, and I'll see you in the next one.